Welcome to the Witches Diagnostic. I'm your host on Dancing Otter on the Warhol Dausa. And this is my dear friend, Ukumbwa Sauti. And he is here talking to me today about creating consent culture, among many other things. Ukumbwa is a 16-year professor of education and is a steward of men's work as well as consent work. And I welcome you again, Ukumbwa, to the Witches Diagnostic. Thank you for having this conversation with me today.
And thank you so much for asking, Dawn. And I really appreciate being here. An honor to be here again. And yes, thank you for that introduction. And yes, I had been teaching higher ed for 16 years or so, and within that, I did a lot of work on media studies. So, and my perspective was always looking at culture through the lens of media, not just media for media's sake. So we've been having I've been having conversations with younger people, adults, around these issues of patriarchy, of misogynoir, and thank you, Dr. Moya Bailey, for that term, for misogyny, and men's violence against women, things like that, for a long time. But more recently, in the last 5-6 years or so, really developing, my ideas and work around men's work, organizing with local men's groups in the New England area, connecting with people as far away as Minnesota and the northern part of the United States. Also, there's a men's walk happening right now in Sierra Leone, to 520-mile walk to raise awareness about men's violence and rape culture, and supporting children and women's, and everybody's learning around those kinds of things. So as we speak, men are doing this kind of work, and I'm trying to support that also. So yeah, there's a number of ways that I come at this, and also have been teaching consent online and in other places, in other contexts, with Jessica Mertel and other folks in sex positive communities and things like that.
Amazing. Thank you so much for doing that work in the broader community, and for offering it in online ways often, so that people can connect in from other parts of the world who need this work. I want to start simple. When we talk about consent culture or building consent culture, what does that mean to you?
Building consent culture is a key concept for us to talk about, because we don't have that in the context of oppression, that we live in right now, globally, worldwide. And it shows itself in different ways in different parts of the world, but it's a generalized concept. But this idea of consent culture is really talking about autonomy, not only in the person, a person's body and in their identities, but also in groupings of people. What levels of consent can we talk about that communities have, or need to work on, or need to identify? What are the international levels of consent culture that we need to look at? And within economic systems, and as I say here in the United States, on the land of the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag, the injustice system that exists, in the United States of America and settler colonies. So, how do we create and talk about consent within these contexts of oppression, and in the knowing that we all deserve consent? We all deserve to have these conversations, and to have our consent and boundaries and our cultural context respected, so that we can be fully human for whoever we are, in whatever chosen and other contexts that we are living in right now. So it has a lot to do with boundaries. It has a lot to do now with conversations, first and foremost, to have these definitions illuminated, and really talk about what these boundaries are. What are these contexts for consent, and how we protect ourselves, and how we define what is, in a sense, our context of sovereignty as humans and as groups of humans, because it's not only interpersonal, it's international and intercultural.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that you're including the very important concepts around culture and the broader culture of and what has happened in regards to oppression and harm um, and injustice
Hmm.
as a part of the conversation around consent. Because I feel like oftentimes when I'm talking to people about consent, their idea is that it's first and foremost kind of a conversation about sexuality um, and how we have a negotiation
Yes.
between someone we're interested in having sex with and whether or not whether they are interested and how do we proceed. I think that's what most people think is consent,
Right.
and I actually think it's like that is one very little part of what consent means and how we can understand it. It's one very little part of it because of course that's such an important part of it. Like
Really
it's
important.
a really important part. And like when I talk to my children, I have two sons
Mhm.
about consent, and we have that conversation about it being, about sexuality, that about enthusiastic
Mhm.
and continual conversation about is this is this something you want? Is this something that so I'm interested in this? Is this something that you would want as well? And are you enthusiastic about that?
Right.
And what the difference between like yes, enthusiasm and
Mhm.
mm, okay, maybe, and having
Yeah.
that be part of that conversation around, well, that's not actual consent. That might feel like, that person is pressurized. And then we can start talking about why that person might offer that, that okay, when they're not really enthusiastic. Because
Right.
again, we're opening the door to why a person might say yes when they mean no.
Right.
Um, and what might be the outcome of that actually causes harm, even if you've got a yes, that when you're not paying attention to the tone of the yes and having a conversation
Mhm.
around the tone of the yes, that actually it's still with you if
Right.
you're asking the question. It's still with you to go deeper with that person
Mhm.
around why they not be might not be enthusiastic or to not proceed at
Right.
all, if they don't want to have that conversation, right?
Right.
So
Mhm.
yeah, what are your thoughts uh, around that portion of consent, that
Yeah.
portion of that idea of consent?
It's tremendously important. And what it raises for me is two things: a conversation that we have that I've had, with people around consent and negotiation of intimate and sexual situations, where we have to tease out and identify the powers, the power of privilege in these relationships, and whether it's around race, whether it's around gender or sexual orientation or class. We can think of many situations, where people who have a certain kind of power come into the negotiation, and we've heard the stories. I've heard the stories of people, well, this person's been doing this longer, they're rich, they're smart, they're whatever, so I guess whatever they want to do is fine, and they're kind of conceding their yes to for the wrong reasons, the wrong reasons. We're forgetting that our feelings, anyone's feelings, are really important, and any negotiation, any conversation about connection, again, whether it's interpersonal or international, has to be from a place of egalitarianism, and without the filtration and the spoilage of power, unearned power, over one or more of the people in that situation. And the other situation, that comes up was a really poignant moment when I was teaching in higher ed. And I'd been showing students a video of Andrew Dice Clay. And I don't know if you know him, he's a so-called comedian. And he made his money in a lot of ways in the backlash against feminism. Susan Faludi writes about this in a really great way, and many others. But kind of reinforcing, oh, real men are real men, and we just need to ask for this. and very happily saying boys will be boys and that's okay because we have our needs, and if we start being sensitive we're not real men, that kind of thing. So that really backwards toxic masculinity thing. Nonetheless, I'm showing a video to my students, and there's a point where he's starting to pressure a woman, in this heteronormative situation, to have sex with him in a car. It's nighttime, he's in a car. So she completely begins to start to signal no to him. He's totally beginning to pressure her. And just like you're saying, sometimes a spoken yes is not a full yes. It's not an enthusiastic yes. But I stopped the video at that moment and I just said, so no means, and I expected the voices just to be cacophonous of all my students, 18, 19 and above, to say, no means no. But there was silence. There was silence, right? And seconds later, it felt like an hour. But some seconds later, a timid voice chimes in from the back of the room and said, maybe? So I clicked off that machine and I said, we need to have a conversation right now because we need to get to that basic piece that yes, no means no. And this is, we need to talk about what that actually means. Because if we're confused on that, and I appreciated that someone said something, but it was ultimately the wrong thing. That's not true. No means no, and we need to respect that. It's a full statement, and it's not a negotiable thing. We don't have to explain it. But that was one of those moments where we're like, well, this conversation is not yet seated in these young adults yet. They're in college, they're doing their things, they're much more independent. And I think the numbers have still been stable over a number of years. It's 1 in 4, sometimes 1 in 3 college students will experience sexual assault, rape, within their time just at the school, let alone the things that happen to us in our younger years. So 1 in 4 is a horrendous number of how sexual assault and rape shows up in these situations. So when that happened in the classroom, I knew we had to stop the tape and really kind of get down to basics about this. So yeah, these issues of what does it mean? What does no mean? What does that enthusiastic yes mean? That's super powerful. The yes is as powerful as a no. But we have to not only be authentic in both of those, or in all of that spectrum of I may not be sure, which means no. At least in that moment, we have to be able to be authentic in that, and we also have to be respectful to others when we hear those no's and those yeses, when we hear those boundaries and those invitations. We have to be willing to respect that, and to say, well, yeah, there's a no there. I really want this, but that doesn't give me the right to force it. And that happens
Right.
all the time. The forcing happens all the time in the political realm. And because this is the culture we live in, it happens in the personal realm, because patriarchy and men's violence against women and these kinds of behaviors are so entrenched in the what I call an anti-culture, the anti-culture. So it doesn't protect people, it doesn't protect children, women, LGBTQ community, trans people, nor does it protect men, but we benefit from it. So, we have this struggle to identify ourselves within it, but also to struggle against this. Yeah.
Wow, thank you for that. I mean, I'm actually quite emotional hearing about your students and your story. So I'm 51. My kind of early years of exploring as a maiden, we'll call it in Irish culture, maiden mother crone. I was a maiden in the 80s and the 90s, that um, there was no real safe place to say yes in an enthusiastic way. There was always this idea that pressure was part of the romantic pursuit, right? So when I talk about rape culture to people, that's what I'm talking about. That the fact that there was a romantic inclination towards the
Yeah.
idea of pressure. That if if a man really wants, so if you're heteronormative, if a man really wants a woman,
Yeah.
then he's going to come on strong.
Right. Because that's
Uh,
how we do it.
right. And
Tell us
she's going
more.
to eventually surrender.
Right.
And so then you think about when you really dismantle the role playing that happens there,
Hmm.
and you dismantle the idea of it being romantic,
Hmm.
and you actually look at it purely from a place of human beings having sovereignty.
Right.
Uh, the only way that sex happens in that kind of a scenario is if this woman here is not in her sovereign place, that she is either resisting the possibility of being raped, or she's saying yes so that she doesn't have to face that. And I think about it as so, this sort of cultural PTSD with women, that of my age. I'm sure that it's not just in my generation, but I notice it in particular in my generation because all of our media pronounce that, like all of our movies and all of our big celebrity love stories and all of our politics really reinforce that.
Hmm.
And we also had this kind of like still hanging on clause of religiosity in the 80s and 90s where that still really had a hold, and I think it's getting less. um, I think it's getting less that, like, we're still seeing the influence of religiosity, but it was much more entrenched, I think, in those generations. And most of us were raised kind of to not question that, that men need to be dominant and women need to be submissive because that's the way shit works. That um, for me, as a woman now, a crone
Hmm.
now, I look at that and I'm horrified. I am horrified by the amount of times I had non-consensual sexual experiences. Never mind the time where I was overtly attacked.
Right.
The covert, the fella just like, she said yes, so it's all good. She said
Right.
yes. Never mind that he's, twice my size. And like, if I said no, would it matter?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
to me, the horrifying. So when I hear people, when you say, so no means, and nobody knows, I'm like, wow, I know that's an opening place for a conversation, but
Hmm.
what hurts my heart is to know it's still there
Yeah.
in such a big way, that it's still there in such a big way. And that in some ways, Andrew Dice Clay being kind of like like the archetypal Lothario of my generation of,
Yeah.
you know, anti-feminists,
Right.
um, that there are present day versions of that
Oh yeah.
that's
Totally.
justify themselves in the backlash of movements that started in misogynoir around Me Too,
Yeah.
um, that
Hmm.
started and, in those very entrenched uh, experiences of oppression and pressure and no real consent and deep rape culture
Hmm.
and also racism,
Yeah.
that there are men that have risen up out of that experience and gone, we better just make sure that our privilege is protected here, or that our ability to oppress is still available to us.
Right.
And so I see that here and now in some figures. It's of course now they declare themselves to be anti-political correctness, as though respect is somehow politically correct, which is bizarre. But
Right. And that sensitivity becomes politically correct, but we don't talk about sensitivity or even that we're talking from a place of lived experience. So when people started to package PC as a negative, I realized what they were doing was just twisting and going back to the status quo of we don't have to really be concerned about other people because oppression is based upon not caring about that, is about asserting power without the human dynamics being a part of it. That's why women get dehumanized, why trans people get dehumanized, why African people and indigenous people get dehumanized, so that there's a story now that exists, well, they deserve that, or that's the only way they can be as good as we are if we guide them. I mean, this whole thing around the, I think the number is 7,310 found bodies around the Christian residential schools, aka concentration camps, that has been part of the indigenous, Native American experience, perpetrated by Christian European colonizers. That within that is that story of dehumanization, is you know kill the Indian, keep the man, that kind of thing. And that, yeah, there was no real humanity there. That whole idea of, the Roman Catholic and Christian idea of terra nullius, that all these non-Christian, which generally meant non-European and indigenous lands, were free for plunder, and the resources and the humanity of them. That's why, uh, rape culture actually got systematized, through the actually daily rape of African women by, again, I'm just going to call it out, Christian European men, in breeder farms, and also just to be in a place of control to dehumanize men. This would be done in front of, these women's partners and community and children and things like that. So this dehumanization process is core to the systems of oppression. And yes, so all of these kinds of dynamics that exist within this are really important to call out, and to see how power destroys, unearned and abusive power, um, destroys consent culture, and keeps it from being grounded, and keeps it from even being talked about. Because we do have these narratives. I've looked at westerns, in the Hollywood tradition, western movies, and most of them are pretty horrendous. I'll just say easily 97% of all the westerns that have ever been made are horrendous, racist, misogynist, patriarchal narratives. I even realized that, what's his name, John Wayne, yeah, he's pretty famous. He says almost the same thing in two different movies, like this whole gaslighting moment of dealing with, relationship of Europeans to indigenous people. He says, oh, yeah, this people's way was a good way, and oops, it's sad that it's over. It's like the total oppressive perpetration apology statement, and it's almost word for word in both movies. When I saw it in the second movie, I'm like, wait a minute, this is not a mistake. That he says it twice, and he's the one we go to for these moments of what the West was. This whole idea, and we don't even talk about manifest destiny and what that means for indigenous women, and what that means for African women in that piece, and the story of how European women were treated. Some of that I just recently heard of how wives would be, the men's wives would be brought into these new places to be prostituted to the other men who were there, and also they'd have others too that they would bring into this horrendous situation of being sexual objects and objects of rape. And that European women didn't escape that, but they were benefiting from the power of patriarchy and, and manifest destiny at some level, all of these dynamics of power are so important, not only to talk about, but then to reconcile and say, well, this means now that these systems have to change, have to come down, have to be shifted, transformed, and I'm just going to say burnt to the ground at some level. That's just what it is. When a house gets too much black mold in it or something like that, you got to take that timber down.
Mhm.
There's no amount of wallpaper that's going to cover that up, and for you to be healthy in that space. So we have to be able to be brave and courageous about this. And also, I just have to acknowledge that all the survivors that have ever survived, rape culture, we have to start to listen to these voices. And this is what's the beginning of any reconciliation process, is to know that these things are real. They happen to real people. And one of the things I'm trying to do right now is just to identify, I've published a story of my own around my own sexual trauma and experience with that, having my own boundaries crossed. And so, that we all need to talk about this, but we also need to be honest about who holds power in these situations and how does power create the situations in which there is harm on a daily basis. Yeah.
Mm. Wow, yeah, that's powerful. That analogy of burning it down, I was just thinking about that being interesting and ironic um, recapitulation. You know, you burn villages and witches, and then
Mm,
we burn down some of this deep toxicity,
yeah.
as you're calling it, mold. Because, and
Yeah.
then to bring that into what the metaphor from, and mold is a culture, right? Like,
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
that sometimes we wonder how we got here, in our thinking. Like I think about even my own healing process around reclaiming my sovereignty, or even claiming it the first time. Okay, like I don't think I was born knowing it, nor do I think that it was ever nurtured. um I think that I may have had a glimmer of it from a spiritual perspective when I was young, and knew that there was something I was growing towards. So there was something in my culture, in my personal culture. But and I also think way back, even in my own indigenous culture, the Irish folk, Scottish folk, that those folk in their villaging had an idea of sovereignty, and what they would do to protect it.
Hmm.
You know, not just women, but like people together in a village.
Yeah.
One of the things um, that I really feel needs to needs to be talked about, in my perspective, is not just about the harm, because there's definitely a need for conversation around harm,
Yes.
but also like, how do we hold ourselves accountable so that we can create
Hmm.
um, some healing, so that there can be some of that recapitulation. Like some of that needs to be burned down, as you said, and some of it is like, well, what do we keep? Because some of the things that we need to keep around, like we've been in the direction of not of plundering, we've been in the direction of creating these deep harms, and so now how do we move in the direction of creating a conversation that is inclusive
Hmm.
and also respectful, and
Right.
it creates a belonging of humanity, and also other creatures, not just humans, but also other creatures, and also other layers of seen and unseen. How do we restore the culture in a way that includes all of these wonderful life forms, um, so that we can move forward in a healthy way and restore, maybe something that never, maybe it's not restoration because maybe it never existed. I'm
Hmm.
not entirely sure.
Yeah, I'm going to say, and it's such a great question you pose and context you pose, and I think it did exist. I think it did exist. Because we can look back as far as, and I'm no expert on the concepts of Ma'at that come out of Kemet, ancient Egypt. These concepts of balance in life and, with each other and with, the earth around us and the spiritual realm. There are codes, we can look at even, Ifa, in West Africa and talk about the concepts of balance and understanding and of seeing each other and understanding each other's energies, understanding how our energies are held in our bodies through, from spirit, from the world around us. So these concepts of balance and respect, I think, have been around forever. Now, have we been perfect at executing those and acknowledging those energies all the time? No, 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 no. But I think by and large we wouldn't be here today if we didn't have systems that, in mirroring nature, that we find out how do we live amongst each other, with each other, in a way that we're promoting each other's life. And I think one of the things that's really key, the word that came up for me as you were talking, or as you're completing, your sharing a minute ago, was the word inviolability. and we could call that the sacred. The way we get back to, and I'll call it that, and go forward with cultures of peace and justice and compassion, and real lovingness, radical love for each other, is to see the inviolability in each of us that we all have, as human beings, a level of divinity, sacredness, humanity that cannot be broached. We cannot broach that. That's what the LGBTQ and the trans community, indigenous people, um, African people in particular within that, and even us as we've been in the diaspora. It's what women have been asking for as long as we've been dealing with these imbalances. And some of them are very clear, like European colonialism showed up at particular times, things like that. In certain cultures, we understand where, patriarchy took hold, things like that. So we can get to that. But to free ourselves of it, we have to acknowledge the inviolability of each other. Like when we look at a child, we have to know that, oh, I do this because that child deserves a free and unencumbered life, to be fully who that child is from this moment to the ancestral realm. Okay, that we don't change their story because there are cultural stories that are important to hold on to, and that just because a white man writes a book from Harvard doesn't mean that it changes the culture of the people he's talking about. And we see plenty of those situations, of where the people in power get to tell the stories and control the narratives. And that's where the problems with media are right now and things like that. But if we begin to see each other as inviolable, or the spider, the tree, the forest, the oceans as inviolable, that we all deserve to be here because the creators and the divinities that we all have, all of our cultures have defined, and I think there is no culture that hasn't defined a sacred relationship with itself and with its environment. That's just generally the truth of humanity. Um, that we have this concept that there are certain things that are inviolable. We don't mess with the water. I'm just kind of, like, yeah, don't mess with the water because we need to, uh, kind of being funny here, but it's true. We don't do that. Okay, fast forward to the modern world, and we have systems in place to actually exploit water and exploit people's relationship to water, and to sidetrack it from certain places, and certain people don't get the water they deserve, and parts of the land don't get the water they deserve. And so we have this, what I call a enviro benefit displacement. We steal water from one place and take it to another place. This whole bottled water capitalist thing is part of that process. The whole extractive industry is benefit displacement. We're taking something from here and putting it over there. There should be no city of Las Vegas. I don't know if anybody listening or other understands what Las Vegas is. This casino town, basically, that's in the middle of the desert. Why would there be a, a golf course in the middle of a desert where the water doesn't support that? We're displacing, enviro benefits, resources, and taking to a place where it's not sustainable. We did that to African people. We took humans from Africa and displaced them around the world for the sake of enslavement and empowerment. And so all of these kinds of things, this that we're inviolable, has to be understood and respected. And that's an oppression cuts that all down, the unearned power that numbers of groups have right now.
So deep. I just was thinking about, as it was percolating in me when you were talking about the inviolability of water, um, and how it's relating to this conversation about consent. That when you consume something, there is a trust level that whatever you're consuming is something your body needs and desires and wants and will do good things and support your health, right? Like when I have a glass of water from the tap here in Esquimalt, the Kongan territory, it's clean for the most part. I'm sure there are a bunch of other things in it that may interact with me, but for the most part, uh, bacterial wise, I'm drinking fairly clean water. That um, ironically and tragically and terribly, that on reserve territories in Canada, the first people are the most are drinking some of the most toxic water, or they have to boil, or they actually have to drive a certain you know, extent of road to get to drinkable water. And that, I think of that as, and again, you know, when we consider the idea of reconciliation, I think it's really interesting because I'm like, well, what are you reconciling here? Canada, we never actually had a good, a good and decent and equal kind of partnership with that that we're getting back to. We never had it because we're still actually oppressing through resource. We're oppressing through invasion into land, and the fact that you can still mine on land that is actually, you know, reserved for First Nations folk. That whether there were treaties or not, our government is still selling rights to mine these places or adjacent to these places where they toxify them. Like, there's no understanding of how you hold it sacred, so that the people that were holding sacred attunement to the land,
Right.
whose ancestors are still, their bones are deep, deep in the land, that we're still in any level honoring that, that is those, if that dies, we will go with it.
Right.
That is extinction.
Yes.
You know, and I also think about the thing that percolates for me is that so the stories of Patrick, when Patrick came back to Ireland and started to whisper in the ears of chieftains around the biblical sort of manifest destiny of, you could be in power forever and you don't ever have to ask the women of the village to empower you. Your sons can be powerful and their sons can be powerful. You can have an inherited throne, just like the British had this inherited throne, rather than to go to the village women and ask them who is best to stand in a place of power, so that they are protecting not only the village and the people and the county, but also the land, because the land was sovereign before, like, be above people. The land was above people, right?
Right.
And so when that started to reverse itself with Patrick's narrative, it was very, as you call it, the Roman Catholic Church. I love how you spell that, Roamin apostrophe Catholic Church. They love that whole Rome.
Rome planet.
Yeah, they
I
certainly
mean,
name
that's
themselves well.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So when they started to introduce a more patriarchal form of that church in Ireland, one of the first things that Patrick did was to rename wells that were named for goddesses, that were named for feminine energies, because they were sources of nourishment for a village. The first thing he did was rename them, because those wells, the story he told was, that's hedonistic, that pagan culture is satanic, it's evil. So he renamed these wells. So every glass of water that you take from a Patrick well would have the signature of that energy, right? And so you see how that, even that subtlety of like renaming a well, it changes what it is you're consuming in the first place. And so then that takes a hold and does something internally. Or at least, like, I don't have I have historical evidence of that happening. And I have the ability to see that that certainly has happened.
Yeah.
But some people might call that a correlationship rather than a causation situation. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I think thousands of years would play out that it's causation, or hundreds of years at least that it's causation. When you take water and you own it,
Yes.
you're really subtly saying to people, we own you as well. And every time you have a glass of our owned water, you're having a glass of us and our mission statement, let's say. And so in some cultures they call that bad medicine.
Yeah.
Um, in ancient Irish culture, they might refer to that sort of in the realm of sorcery. You know,
Yeah.
um, and these things are not, I think, unheard of in these. I think they're very deliberate.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
mhm.
it is deliberate, and it has been deliberate, and I think, in even in what we now call Italy, we call it it's called the Roman Catholic Church for a reason, that where the Vatican set itself up, and where, the Roman Catholics began to oppress people, the indigenous people, and particularly women in a particular way, of course, but sadly, they changed the names of those things, of those places. That's why naming has been really problematic in North America, South America, every place. Even what we now call, Victoria Falls, it was called Mosi Oyotunya. And I believe it's oh the this oh see, now I'm gonna mess it up. I got to work on this, but and I've talked about it, written about it, but but I think it's the water that roars, or the smoke that roars, something like that. But there was a name that the indigenous people gave it that was important to understanding its power, and our connection to it. So renaming it something, especially a colonial queen, please give me a break. Seriously? We're going to name it Victoria Falls? No, sorry. That's destructive. It's the same as, um, and we see it in the movie Roots, the series, about African enslavement, and Europeans doing that. They changed the name of the African enslaved to something else, so we don't have the power of that person, the identity of that person. Just the way that drumming, and even using the mbira, which we call the thumb piano, in some ways, in some places, was illegal, because the Christian Europeans, knew that we had a power connection, our own identity, our grounded power connection to our deities, to our ancestors, through the use of particular instruments. That's why, even within the last 5 years, I heard a story of Roman Catholic priests in the Sakata culture in the Congo, asking the people to burn their sacred items, to burn them. One of the things, and part of my story connection to that, was this person at Cultural Survival Bazaar. And Cultural Survival is a local, indigenous advocacy organization that does a lot of great work. Its board is all indigenous people. Nonetheless, at this bazaar, this man said, "Yeah, this statue here, or this mask, was from the Sakata people, the Roman Catholic priests, recently. I'm just going to say recently. I don't know the year. That's not the point. But it was recent, within the last 10 years. That's recent. Had been asking the people to destroy their sacred items because, of course, as you're saying, even in Ireland, they say it's demonic, it's satanic, things like that. Now, what the item was, as it was explained to me, was this thing that is used in the birthing process to bring strength to the birth process. I was horrified at this. And you know, it wasn't surprising, but it twists the heart, because you understand, seriously, these people on this part of the earth have created this situation where they want to support the birth process, for it to be healthy, for it to be blessed, sacred. And these Roman Catholic priests are coming in to say, burn these items? What? These things that help us, guide this process, for women and others who give birth, to do it in a healthy, beautiful, organic way. Come on. So clearly they dehumanized the people there. They destroyed, cultural connections in this moment. These things are happening. And so, yeah, this issue of consent, culture, and power. I'm reminded, with what you were saying, of the struggle of the Gidimten and Wet'suwet'en people, who are being attacked not only by the oil companies, but also the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, who are, jailing people on unceded lands for saying no, for drawing a line on their sacred earth by saying, no, you can't come here. We do not give you consent to be here. But the police force attacks them. There's videos out there, if people choose to find them, where the agents from the oil company will come in with some piece of paper and say, we're supposed to be here to do this, and it's just like a rapist showing up and saying, I'm going to do this to you no matter what you say. And that's exactly what's happening at that moment, and there's great resistance to that. And that's a situation again where consent culture is being destroyed. The inviolability not only of their culture but of the land is being destroyed, and those folks know very clearly, because they live there, what the land was like, what the waters were like, and how important it is to protect that. you know so the further we get away from our own authentic selves, our own authentic cultures, our own authentic ways of understanding ourselves, our bodies, the lands that we come from, and our traditions, the further we get from that, the easier it is for these dehumanizing processes, these oppressive processes, to continue to take hold and to fester, and especially when we don't call them out, when we don't highlight them, and when the folks that are part of it, like men, don't take accountability for that. you know and when we do begin to take accountability, or white people or in Christians saying, yeah, we are here because of this legacy, that's serious. Like, I'm in this place because of this horrible legacy, and I have to make this right. It's my job to make it right. I'm responsible for my actions based upon that I'm here because of this power and privilege. So, within this, conversation about consent culture, we have to be able to have these inordinately empowered groups, like men, like white men, European men, rich people, people who control land, and many times those are people that just have access to the military and to the police. That's what that is. That we have to look at that, and we have to illuminate that, and we have to start to dismantle those systems. But we have to begin to look at each other as inviolable. That not only is the tree behind us, in reality, the land, the waters inviolable, but the people who protect them and steward them are inviolable also. And there's a tremendous, again, with what the indigenous women have been saying, for many, many years now, is, around the MMIW campaign, missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, and 2S folks, Two-Spirit people, that around these pipeline construction comes rape, comes murder of indigenous people. African people have experienced this too. New cities were not safe to us that were going up, and obviously our placement on plantations, where we were chattel, and experiencing chattel enslavement. We know that these are dangerous things. We know that this power is dangerous, but that it's very real, it's very present, it's very now, and it's historical too. And we can't continue it into the future. We can't.
Mm. Thank you for sharing all that, Ukumbwa. I'm actually very, I'm feeling so much grief around what you're sharing. The knowledge that, or the obviousness around, here in British Columbia,
Yeah,
um,
it is.
is two very fun words to use together, where isn't that a powerful cursing of a land, and a possession of a land? If we were ever confused about the desire to claim the wilds of this part of the world, I mean, yeah.
Right.
But the fact that our Royal Canadian Mounted Police Force,
Mhm.
which is currently our provincially designated police force, or a governmentally designated police force, will constantly and consistently show up to the benefit of corporate interest, and of these companies that have quote unquote mining rights, They will consistently and constantly protect them. They have no interest in protecting actual like citizens who are concerned about old growth forest destruction or water destruction or sacred land destruction. They have no interest in protecting those people at all. I mean, I think it's so interesting because every time you turn on a conversation on the news, the representatives of the RCMP will say, well, the people themselves, like the first people themselves, they want these projects. This is the other piece of consent, which I find really like so toxic, is the weaponization of first voices. That if you leverage corporate interest and money for people who really don't have a lot of leverage in those communities, but still require the need for some currency to happen in terms of money, because maybe their families need actual like homes that have that are warm and safe, and maybe they actually need clean water. So they are often leveraged by these big corporate interests, and they'll say, well, then you have jobs, and then you'll have, then you'll be able to afford XYZ, these things that were taken and actually not supported in your communities, and also compromised within your communities based on governmental and corporate interests, instead of actually like recognizing that there is a need for the people to be where they are, praying their prayers, because that actually is a prayer for all of us too. That they're praying for us to come to our senses. They're not praying for our demise. That's something that blows my fucking mind all the time. I'm like, the prayers that are being prayed for us to come to our senses, they just continue. They just continue regardless of the pressure and the oppression that happen. Right. And this is what makes me emotional about that. You feel, I recently I live close to where the Pachidat are protecting what's now known as the Fairy Creek old growth forest in the areas around a place now known as Port Renfrew. That the Pachidat land there, the heritage, the chieftain, the heritage elders, who, when we say heritage, they've chosen them, not like the government has chosen representatives of the Pachidat Nation, which is why it's all very fucking confusing, because people go, oh, well, if their people say it's okay, then we should listen. I'm like, well, they're representatives that were chosen by the government, and they have like a relationship that way of leverage. So again, we're talking about consent, we're talking about leveraging consent, which is not really consent, that the leverage that's happening there is not chosen by the Pachidat people, and the actual Pachidat people who are saying, Pachidat is actually how it's pronounced, I'm mispronouncing that. The Pachidat are coming to these protests and saying, this land is sacred, these trees are sacred, these are our elders, these are the prayers we're praying for this land all the time. And the RCMP show up and they arrest those people, they arrest those elders, but they won't, and then our government, in British Columbia say, well, actually the Pachidat elders say they want us there, they want those jobs. And like, again, this is another version of that consent conversation. Is there real consent when there's leverage happening? Is there real consent in that power structure? No, there can't be. And so it's really mind-blowing that our governments are pushing those narratives as though that's a good reason to be in business in that way, because we're doing good things for those people. It's like, well, what about the creaturehood of the trees themselves, which are our elders, our thousands of years old elders, these beings, right? What about the protection of the creaturehood? Because if it's non-human, then it's not considered to be worth protecting, or it's considered to be like usable resource. But nobody's actually talking about the creaturehood of those forests,
Right.
and like the greater expansiveness of the creaturehood of those forests. So when you were speaking about the that that relationship of plundering, and that relationship of like leveraging, that relationship of pressurizing of rape culture, we're really talking about that which will rape unseen beings, or unacknowledged beings, unacknowledged life forms.
Right.
You know, that trees are considered to be resources, but they're life forms, they're alive. You know, they're not houses, they're not, you know, toilet paper, they're not, they're alive.
Totally.
You know, and
Yep.
and that we are creating this um, narrative that somehow we're doing a favor to these people. And it just, to me, is again, you know, this same kind of conversation that erases erases the sacredness or the inviolability
Mhm.
of life.
Right.
And what is further misunderstood is that, you know, these governmental people who are forcing these narratives, and this drive of privilege that's happening, is that they will steal their own oxygen in the process. They will steal their own pure water in the process. They will kill their own salmon in the process
Mhm.
of forwarding this narrative, as though they have somewhere else to go.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. CNN was advertising, I think it happened already, a special called The Hunt for Planet B. And so I understood it to be a search for planets that were like Earth, this Earth that we're on right now. Um, and I know behind it, I know this, that behind that is, how do we get stuff from that planet to this planet? Or how do we get people, generally privileged people, from here to the other planet so that we can enjoy the fruits of somebody else's labor and somebody else's resource exploitation, to continue the Wetico disease, as Jack Forbes called it, the cannibalism that is central to this concept of not only just European colonialism, but other oppressive forces. I think that's the nature of patriarchy too, and we see it most grossly in white male patriarchy, and racism. So, right now, so, that even the idea of we're going to look for another planet says those people have failed, not humanity. I often correct people to say, oh, people are awful. I just don't want to be around people. It's like, wait a minute, you got to choose what people. This is not everybody that are creating these problems. We can be really clear because they have faces and names. So we can name the people who are causing these problems. But even the idea of saying we're looking for a planet B means that the dominant system is a failure. Bam. There's no other, that's the end of that sentence. You know, the dominant culture, anti culture, as I call it, has been, and that's generally capitalistic and generally colonial, has failed because you're looking for a whole new planet. All right? No, that's not how you do it. That's not how you show that you're intelligent. That's not how you show that you understand that the last 3 million years of human creation, hominids, whatever we want to call ourselves, you know, by European standards, they say Lucy in the Olduvai Gorge was 3 million years old, and that was a human type person, you know, in Africa. So if we're 3 million years into this development of our humanity, that's a serious investment that we need to look at. And that's why when we look at indigenous cultures, they're the ones at the top of the leadership for advocating for the earth. And I think about a young person who I heard about Elizabeth Wathuti in Kenya, who is somewhat continuing the work of Wangari Maathai in Kenya, who started the Green Belt movement. And Elizabeth Wathuti is an operative or leader in I believe it's the Green Generation Initiative, which is also planting trees and really dealing with this issue of, revitalizing our environments and things like that, and really being smart and intelligent and authentic and accountable to what our environments are like, what our environments need, and how we need to relate to each other to say that if we even deserve to go to another planet. And who knows what else is on that other planet and what they're going to do to it, because if they go to it with the European colonial idea, it's going to be decimated in another 100 years. We know this. We know this. Um,
Totally.
we do know this. So, I just want to bring up, I'm also reminded of the work of Lisa Bruner, who's an indigenous woman who, I've shared about her talking about how we treat women is how we treat the earth. How we treat the earth is how we treat women. Other people have said that. There's books by Carolyn Merchant and Susan Griffin that talk about that. The legacy of, what we do to the bodies of women, we do to the earth. We can talk about the rape of the earth and the rape of women and the rape of the divine feminine, and also pulling the feminine out of the masculine and saying, yeah, there's a spectrum here. There's, these energies exist, but how we treat certain people is how we treat the earth also. And so that's a legacy that has to be dealt with. And so this whole conversation about consent culture is about our bodies, is about, women's and other bodies, and also the earth itself, because we have no culture without the earth. They're intertwined, like the
Mhm.
mycelium network, that I'm learning about still, that between the trees and how they, and the fungi and how they communicate and how they support each other and how they, understand things and remediate things within the forest life, the diversity of the forest. It's just a model for us. And, when we look at indigenous cultures, nature has always been the model for us because it's our context. It's the first classroom. It'll be the last classroom, the first and last way we learn. To be able to acknowledge these things, to be able to get past the narratives that we've talked about, minutes and we could have been talking for days right now. I don't know.
We could have been talking for
I
days.
don't even know. I don't even know. And I'm a water clan, so I have no concept of time without a clock in my face. So anyway, is it still Monday or Tuesday? But the point is that we have to be able to see past these narratives of oppression, and we have to see past these narratives of violability and dehumanization, desacralization of nature, that says now we can use this sacred thing as a resource and as a thing to create power for a certain group of people. And we have to see who's doing that. Like in my Facebook posts, in my photo albums, I've posted pictures just of the board of directors of certain corporations, because the corporations that do these things have faces and names. There's people responsible for these things. There's people responsible to Chevron and ExxonMobil and Shell and BP and all these kinds of things. And there's people benefiting from these, extractive industries, the mining companies. Like, why would a mining company by France be given rights to mine things in Canada or the United States? I think in Oak Flat that was a situation in the southwest of what we now call the United States. We have to be able to look at this and say, are we respecting the inviolability of humanity, the humanity that is inherent in every human born on this planet, and are we respecting the the nature of the world around us, the character of its stewardship of us as human beings. It stewards us. We're not just the stewards of it. It stewards us.
Mhm.
To think about a tree breathes out what we breathe in. seriously? And we're gonna cut down forests, and let alone the wetlands that protect us from, storm surges, and cleanse the water through the power of nature, or Kwan in my, tradition would say, and we in the tradition that I'm in, the Dagara tradition. Um, we have to look at that. We have to be honest and open and brave and courageous about it. Men have to do that. If we're talking about patriarchy and misogyny, misogynoir, which is, again, thank you, Dr. Moya Bailey, for talking about how race and gender, around women's, empowerment exists for African women, for Black women. Thank you to her for that. And so, this concept of intersectionality, how things are connected. Again, thank you to African women in the Combahee River Collective, that were talking about that years ago. So we have to be able to see this. We have to be able to be brave enough to call out our own systems of power that we participate in. Like a lot of people will say, well, my family wasn't a slaveholder, so why do I have to deal with racism? Oh, it's because you're still benefiting from it. The city
Mhm.
that your folks lived in was economically empowered by the chattel enslavement of African people in your area. Because your folks created, what are they called? Carriages or wheels for things, or tack items, leather items for the horses that were used on these, plantations. We have to look at our connection and our complicity with these systems of oppression. And just like so many women have said, the violence that some men do to women in a very gross way empowers other men to come into situations of negotiation around intimacy and other relationships. We have this unspoken power, and we have to
Mhm.
deal with that, and we have to take that down. We have to destroy those privileges, and really come to a place of knowing that when we share power, when we have an unoppressive conception of power, we have an unbridled conception of love too, and of
Mhm.
compassion, because we're seeing each other for real, and we're acknowledging each other, and we're acknowledging the earth, and all its children, and saying that we are here to respect all of that and the sacred balance that we all live in, but that we don't all feel or have great access to because of the systems of oppression.
Wow. And you've, I believe, offered the real potent medicine that comes from this dismantling process of the current systems of
Uh,
oppression. Like these aren't past systems, they're current systems of oppression.
right now.
And these current stories that are being created now, not because 400 years ago or because 300, no, but now,
Yeah.
these things that are happening now,
Hmm.
that if we're in active dismantlement, what we get some ability to hold.
Hmm.
And we would have to do some real work around being sacred vessels for that, is that we get to love each other. Because I think what's really fascinating about um, what gets highlighted as these new ideas around racism, or these new ideas around misogyny, consent culture, rape culture, misogynoir, these ideas that are new, social justice issues,
Hmm.
these
Right.
ideas that are new, is that um, really folk who are speaking at varying levels of composure, you know, regardless if you're having it as an academic conversation or as an argument or as rage,
Hmm.
you know, that the core of it is like, this is how we don't love each other. This
Right.
is this is the opposite of
Hmm.
loving each other.
Hmm.
And that if you take the leverage out of the conversation, if you stop leveraging me into doing what you want me to do, if I stop leveraging you into doing what I want you to do, what we get to do with each other is find a way where it all works, where everyone gets their needs met.
Right.
And unfortunately, I think sometimes when folk are in used to being in positions of power, and an extraordinary power, some of them, uh, that those positions of extraordinary power, what they imagine is that though if they start dismantling that, that those who have been oppressed will, and this is an old story, right? This is why don't we, free Black folk? Because we don't want them to rise up and do to us what we have done to them.
Mhm.
Um, Not imagining that they actually don't have that drive, because what they really want is belonging and love, because they had it, because they know what that is,
You
because they
remember,
nurtured it, because
yeah.
they still have it. That I think it's so fascinating to me that the people in extraordinary power will look to Indigenous folk here in Canada and say, well, like we don't want to, we don't give them too much space here, because well then, if we give them too much space, then they'll take over, they'll take the land back. And I'm like, first of all, is that such a bad idea? I don't think it is. I don't
Let's
think that's
say
such a
that.
bad idea. I think
Let's
that might
just.
be a better idea than what we're doing right now. But secondly, do you really think that that's what would happen?
Mhm.
Because does that even make sense that a people would just say, just stop killing me,
Mhm.
just stop killing my children,
Right.
just stop erasing me,
Right.
just stop it, so that I can have a voice? That those people are imagining they're going to oppress you, they're going to put you, they're going to make you do things that they've been forced to do, they're going to take your clean drinking water, that they're going to, I don't know why that is the way people in extraordinary power imagine people who are oppressed are going to react.
Mhm.
Like, I actually think it's phenomenal to me that often when men say, well, like, I don't want to give up that dominant kind of way of being, because then women will stand up and they will fuck with us, they
Right.
will take our shit.
Right.
And I'm like, do you really think women have the same ideas that you have, that we're not more creative than that?
Right.
Because actually we're tons more creative and resourceful. We've had to work with a lot less. We've had to work under extreme pressure. We're much more resourceful than just to dominate.
Mhm.
We have way more adaptability. We have way more community. We have
Yes.
way more ability to have a conversation about
Right.
what it is that we want and need than you do. To dominate is not what we have practiced.
Right.
And so when I think about consent culture and what you were just talking about, Reese, in your sharing, is that what happens when we open the door and we dismantle these systems of oppression and privilege is that we get the creative exposure
Right.
of what it is to really not just survive but thrive together, because the creative exposure is of people who learn to thrive in really, really extraordinary circumstances
Right.
rather than in dominant circumstances,
Right.
right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And telling you, it just reminds me, and let me just acknowledge what you just said. Yes, I hear that, and I think everybody needs to hear what you're just saying. That the oppressed are not sitting around saying, "Well, I can't wait to get a hold of patriarchy and call it something else, because boy, that's going to be fun." What? That doesn't even work. We know it doesn't work. Or yeah, let's just flip the script as if it's that easy to say, because that was the story around like that I've heard come up around, allowing, and that's just arrogant in its own way, allowing African people or Black people to have, certain levels of power or just free power. It's like, well, once the numbers, like even the population thing, 51% will be people of color in the United States, the power situation will go haywire. That kind of thing. And there's all this fear and backlash and things like that. And I remind people, the apartheid system in occupied Azania, South Africa, was controlled by a smaller group of people, a minority of people with military power. So it's not about the numbers. It's about who is in control and who's allowed to be sovereign, who's allowed to say that we are human on the face of the earth and we deserve our full cultural humanity. So that's a really big thing there. And so yeah, when we think about what systems will be in place. We know what could be in place. Indigenous people are still doing those things and they're revitalizing languages, not only, in North and South America, but in Africa and many other places. The Sami people in Northern Europe are fighting for their, sovereignty of lands and the caribou herds and the forests that they're tending to for years upon years, prehistory, pre-written history, and that means pre-European written history. So there's plenty of, things that already exist that are still being carried by wisdom keepers all over the world, and are being undercut, by the larger narratives of domination, where we fight against ourselves. We know this. And, when the colonizers say, well, there's a few native people who want this pipeline. And when the rest of the people that we hear from, or, we see on, either we hear them say it or we see it on social media, they're like, no, we don't even know those people. Or we know those people and we know they'd sell us out. That happened for African people too, how politics happens within cities. Deals are made, deals are struck when they, find people who will capitulate to the systems of power. That happens within feminism, around white feminism being, in many ways, a bulwark of white male patriarchy. So, and that's why the push to diversify women's movement has been really key in so many of these areas, to say that it's not just about white, women's voices, or even white straight voices. It's about, much more than that, and that's again why the work of intersectionality that Black women, African women really pulled to the forefront is so important. And we have to listen to those voices. And again, we have to act as though we've heard them. It's one of the things I say in consent conversations. It's important to have someone be heard. What you need is important. Now, I have to act like I heard it and respect it. You know, you say don't come into this sacred forest. You say, yeah, 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 I got you, I got you, got you. But you still go into the forest. Or I say, I don't, I want you to hug me, but I don't want you to touch a certain part of my body. But you still do that. Okay, you heard me, but you're not acting like you heard me. So we have to deliver on the voices that we're listening to, and respect them enough to where our manifestations of behavior and our manifestations of our political structures and cultural and social structures respect the voices and the needs of everyone. And as we're talking about, it includes humans and bugs and rabbits and elk and waterways and waterfalls and everything included, or else we're sort of not doing it right. I'll go on record and say it. If we're not
Um,
including everybody in this discussion and everything in this discussion, we actually are not doing it right. 3 million years of life, I think, support me in that statement, of human life.
Definitely. I also support you in that statement. As
Well,
a
thank
part of those 3 million years of, I support you in that statement as well. Um,
you.
I'm wondering, Akumwa, we could talk forever, could we not? Um,
Kind of could.
what I would love is if we could just take a moment to offer um, some kind of prayer, some kind of uplifting hopefulness to anyone who might be listening, who might be receiving all of this and the incredible potency of what it is that we've shared, and somehow receive the message that it's hopeless or that we're moving towards extinction because the problems are so vast. I'm wondering if we can offer something prayerful. Um, if there's something from your tradition you can offer, or something from your soul that you can offer,
Yeah.
um, that's prayerful.
Yeah, there is. And thank you for that. And I will just begin by saying, I call to not only my ancestors, African ancestors, and some others, to support us in this moment of life, in this really key point in life, to understand what they meant by bringing us all here together. And I call out to any ancestor who is listening right now. And we know they listen. Our traditions tell us they listen and they respond. So I'm speaking from that context, and I'm sort of breaking the fourth wall and saying, yep, ancestors, I know you hear me. I know you're here, and I'm talking to you too. you know. So I ask those ancestors to be present with us. I ask us all to name our ancestors specifically and generally. We may not know the names of all the ancestors who died jumping over the sides of European enslavement ships. We may not know all their names, but we can name them in their experience of their life experience. We may not know all the names of the women who died in the Roman Catholic fires and the Spanish fires of the Inquisition, but we can call them out from their experience. They know our names. We don't know theirs. We can call their names. We can call them out in their experience. So I ask them to be present with us. And in the same prayer moment sharing, I ask us to listen for them, listen for their wisdom, listen for the reason they created us to be here in this moment, not to create um, pain for each other, but to create love for each other. I ask them to be here so that we can feel that, so that we can be courageous, courageous in our next steps from wherever we are on our desks, in front of our in our classrooms, in our corporations, in our organizations, in our homes, in our societies, no matter where we are, in our car, that we step forward the next step. May it be courageous. May it be courageous in saying that we can live through destroying systems of oppression because we lived through the creation of the systems of oppression. We are still here. Indigenes is still here. Indigenous peoples and cultures and lands are still here. May we be courageous to work with our ancestors and work with ancestral traditions that existed way before these global systems of oppression, that we can move forward, that we can all walk powerfully, sacredly, um, and lovingly wherever we are, that all of our next steps may be toward harmony, toward peace, toward justice, toward love, toward a radical compassion that is being waited for by our children. May we look in the eyes of our children who are fresh from the realm of the ancestors and from spirit and say that we love them enough to be courageous, to hand down structures and a holding of them that they know how to move on this earth even better than we do, that we can unlock their creativity, their own humanity, with the guidance of our roots, our ancestral roots, to create such a future and a present and a present and a present, to create a present that is better than the day before, that is better than the day before, so we can visualize it. We must feel it and visualize it, feel it in our heart, in our emotions, to move forward in a way that is beyond our imagination.
Yeah.
May we say their names, may they be with us and walk forward powerfully on this walk toward peace, love, and justice.
Maybe so.
Yeah, and I ask my father, who is my ancestor, he's the lighthouse to my sailboat.
Mm.
Talk to all these other folk, Dad. Marshall Simpson Andrews Jr., I ask you to communicate to all those around you and to the ancestral realm what I just said. Thank you for that work. We'll drink beer together soon. Yeah, that's what we do. Asante, Ashe, and Dio Maisha.
Ukumbwa, thank you so much. Um, I I just want you to know how medicinal your presence is. I notice it. I'm hoping that those who listen will listen through this whole podcast to this very ending and understand that they may need to take this conversation in small pieces because it's a lot. But that what we're offering, what you offer from your heart, is you believe in all the words that you are sharing. That this is not political rhetoric. This is actually the medicine you're walking in the world. And I wanted to talk to you specifically about consent because I knew we were going to have this conversation. That I knew it was going to happen this way. I didn't think we would be just talking about sexuality and body parts, but we'd actually be talking about the greater implications of what it is that we're creating when we create consent culture, and what it is that we are dismantling when we're dismantling rape culture. That it isn't just about straight men and women, and it's not just about um, your next Tinder date, but it's actually really, there's a sacredness that was going unacknowledged. And this conversation was so much more expansive and beautiful than my imagination would even go. And I knew it would be great, but it was so much more inclusive in terms of um, what needed to be given voice. And I'm so grateful to you for giving voice to the so many unacknowledged aspects of our creativity in this world, and our spirits. Um, and I just have so much respect for you. I really do.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Likewise. And I
Uh,
thank you for creating this space.
mm,
Hmm.
Till next time.
Thank you so much, Don. Really appreciate it.